Hello, everyone. I'd like to get started. Thank you for attending. I'm Chuck Larson, Manager of Strategic Projects for the town of Nantucket. This is our listening session, the MVP project, which is one of the final steps in this project with the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program. As many of you know, we've been working with Malone and McBroom to perform this project, and it follows a prescriptive format that the state has put forward to all communities. And the State Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. And we have David Murphy from Malone and McBroom, who's been working with us on this, and he'll walk us through a presentation, after which, it's going to be really informal, questions, answers, anything that pertains to the report as it was put up on the town's website, plus, any other content related to the presentation. So, take it away.
Hey everybody, you can hear me all right? Small room, okay. So quick agenda for the presentation tonight. It's a very short presentation. You'll be happy to hear. We'll talk about what the MVP process is about. We'll just touch on that. Revisit the prioritized risks and hazards. Talk about the community vulnerabilities and strengths. And we'll finish with the top priority actions and the next steps. One thing I want to say right off the bat on this first slide, these middle bullets, we're letting you know what we heard at the workshop. So if you've been to previous presentations that I've been a part of, or the town's been a part of about hazards and risks, we've kept it very factual. This is not to say this is not a factual presentation, but we're letting you know what we've heard about. So it's a little bit different than the hazard mitigation plan meetings that you might have been to in the past. Okay? So a little bit of an overview of the workshop. We start with a map. So that's a map of Massachusetts, and the dark blue towns are those that had already gone through this planning process as of last fall, and then the light blue towns are those that are finishing up the planning process right now. So you can see that Nantucket is a light blue color, and the state hopes that next year many more towns will be added to this map, and eventually all the towns in the Commonwealth will have gone through this specific planning process. So the MVP program is predicated on what is known as the CRB, because we love acronyms, Community Resilience Building approach, which is stakeholder driven. So unlike something that's public driven, stakeholder driven means that the public kind of lets us know who their representatives are. Those people come out and they participate in the workshop. There's two opportunities that come up when this process is over. The planning grant, should you want to apply for planning grants, but that's not something that the town would do. The action grants, called action planning grants, but the action grants are what's coming up next. And that the town, I believe, we'll talk about this at the end, under next steps, the town is going to be applying for a grant to help implement some of the things that came out of this MVP process. All right, I feel like I've been in alphabet soup, so why don't we just dive into it right now and just kind of go through some of the content, and we can get back to this. So what is resilience? It's the R of the CRB, Community Resilience Building. It's always good to have kind of a refresher of what resilience is. Resilience means reducing risk, so that we can pick up the pieces more quickly after an event, a storm, a flood next time. If you've heard me speak, you know I love math, so risk has two parts, vulnerability and frequency. We really can't do a lot about frequency of a storm, but we can do a lot about what's vulnerable. And so that's where the V in the MVP comes in, Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness. So CRB has the R, risk, MVP has the V, vulnerability. So if you put it all together, what we're trying to do is find a way to reduce vulnerabilities so that we can reduce risks and become more resilient. That's the long and short of it. The MVP process asks that we look at infrastructure, social, economic, natural environment, historic resources as the components of what makes us vulnerable or what gives us strength. So what goals and objectives? I love to have people talk. pick on you guys enough. I never pick on you guys. So someone tell me what a goal is versus an objective. So, sir, what's a goal versus an objective? Right? Don't remember your name. I'll use you instead.
A goal is when you score the point, and the objective is how you figure out to play the game.
That works. That works. So objectives are more, the pieces of how you put the puzzle together. The goal is kind of the puzzle. So I love what you said. So the goals of the CRB process, which is what MVP is predicated on, are to have a dialogue, understanding, collaborate, stakeholders, support actions to become more resilient, and to integrate with the hazard mitigation plan and the coastal resilience plan. Whereas the objectives are exactly how we do that. In the workshop, we characterize the hazards, we looked at current risks and future risks, we looked at strengths and vulnerabilities, and we agreed on priority actions. So the hope is that these objectives will meet the goals as part of this planning process. Hopefully you've looked at the report. We tried to keep it really brief, so it would be a quick read. It follows the template of all the states' MVP reports. It's about 15 pages of text, maybe 18 pages of text with appendix pages at the end. This is the cover page. This is the table of contents. We're not doing a page-by-page review. So the workshop that we had back in January and the report are kind of set up the same way. We started with a discussion of the hazards. And we said to the people in the room at the workshop, these are the hazards in your hazard mitigation plan. Which ones do you think are the most important to address in this workshop? And we heard coastal flooding, we heard severe storms, sea level rise, erosion, high wind, wildfire, and drought as the top concern hazards. I want to be really clear right now that these are not mutually exclusive. We're not putting things in silos, right? So the severe storm might have high wind as a part of it. Erosion might occur, might not occur. Coastal flooding may occur as part of the severe storm. Unless it's a tornado, then of course it's just a high wind. And then as sea level rises, some of these things might become worse over time. So again, these are not mutually exclusive, and that's okay. The hazard mitigation plan, if you've seen it, kind of worries about addressing each one separately because that's what FEMA wants to see. But in the MVP workshop, we were allowed to kind of commingle these, and I think that's kind of nice. Unless you're someone that likes to have things in boxes, then it can be a little bit upsetting. Like my kid might not like that we're missing together, but he wasn't there. So those are the hazards that we used in the workshop to inform our discussion. And so this is what we heard from the 4 breakout groups in the larger group. The infrastructure that we need to be concerned with includes roads and what can happen to our roads. They can be inundated. There are areas of roadways that can be eroded. Bridges can wash out. Snow drifting, like a Milestone Road, can be a problem. Can block access to and from Wisconsin on that road. And then we talked a lot about on the workshop about connection to the mainland, to the Cape. So travel interruption from the weather, whether it be by air or by boat. The airport has some erosion risk as well as having real wind risk. Can't land airplanes. And then sea level rise could be, is it affecting the boat terminals? We don't know yet. We oftentimes take it for granted that our water dependent uses are going to pick up their pieces on their own, kind of pull the bridges up and respond. But do they need our help over the long term? We talked about that a lot. Also, under infrastructure, we talked a lot about electrical utilities. We talked about the underwater cables, the Candle Street substation, overhead lines, buried lines after the power is already on the island in the town. And then we talked a little bit about peak load in the summertime. Have we reached a carrying capacity for many things we talked about during the workshop, but electricity was one of the things that we talked about. What if we can't get enough power through those 2 lines, and what if there's a risk to one of them and we lose access to one of them? What if there's a power loss on the mainland? So we talked about all that. We talked a lot about water and wastewater utilities, erosion risks out the 2 beach field beds, 2 separate wastewater treatment plants. We talked about saltwater intrusion risk into groundwater, which we use for water supply, whether it be for the private wells or the public water systems. We talked about corrosion of infrastructure as sea level rises and that saltwater freshwater interface at the edge of the land surface migrates inland and hits some of those pipes. What will happen? Water leaking in the sanitary sewer pipes as well from the surface or from underneath. We talked about all of that. And under the category of infrastructure, we talked about municipal facilities. So we don't always think about the building that we're in as being a piece of our infrastructure, but it really is. And the things that are inside of this building are also infrastructure. So important records and files, IT systems, vehicles that the town owns that they need to use to either rescue people or bring sandbags to some area or just get from point A to point B. If you're driving through salt water more often, is there a risk to those vehicles? And then the finance department in Washington Street, which we've been hearing about for almost a decade, I feel like, since the first hazard mitigation plan, where there are important records and it's at risk of flooding. Still under the category of infrastructure are emergency services. So we have to be able to get to people who are in need, and we have to be able to get supplies out, whether it's bringing things to shelters or sandbags to a place that needs to be protected. We certainly don't want to have public works on the other side of a bridge that's going to be washed out. So making sure we can get between these important assets, fire station, satellite garages, police department, hospital, new hospitals under construction, the high school. Are the emergency alerts effective? Are they doing their job? These are all things that we talked about in the category of infrastructure. Moving on to environmental. So we talked about a lot of natural resources that are present in the town, the ponds, the shoreline itself, fisheries and shell fishery resources, beaches, the bluffs, the moorlands, wildlife that inhabits all these areas. What are the benefits of these resources? We know that they protect us from hazards, but they also are an important component of why we're all here. Why people live here and why people visit here, and why people are doing research here. Frankly, I mean, there's a UMass field station here, for goodness sake. Is it here for a random reason? There's some great resources to be looking at in Nantucket. For some recreation, aquaculture, and then insulating us from some of the hazards. These things are definitely strengths, but they also have risks that are inherent to them. Some of them are made out of water. Water is a risk, it can flood us. Sea level is rising, erosion might be quickening in some areas, not in others. Is that damaging our resources? Do they have time to recover and be resilient on their own? Do we have to help them along? These are things that we're still kind of learning. And are we making things worse for these resources? We talked a lot in the workshop about our social resources. And this is something that I think is really important because this doesn't happen organically in other planning processes like the hazard mitigation plan, even really that much in the coastal resilience plan. We're finishing up an MVP planning process in Chicopee, Massachusetts, which seems like the most furthest place in the world from Nantucket. But just like we did in January at this workshop, we talked in Chicopee a lot about social resources and the safety nets that we have in the community. Are they adequate? Not only are they at risk, but are those things that we can use to promote resilience? And we had the same discussion here. So there are disadvantaged groups. There are some language barriers in town, not a whole lot, but minority immigrant populations that are coming from other places that maybe don't speak English as a first language. Not a lot, but some homelessness issues that could be coming up. Low mod income populations, those who are bound to their home, our island home, the elderly who we need to pay special attention to during disasters. So we talked about all of that. These things are vulnerabilities, but they're also strengths, right? If you think about it, some of these types of populations can really offer us some lessons in resilience. We talked about historic resources, of which there's great interest in Nantucket, and they are at risk to a lot of climate-related hazards. Continuing on, neighborhood associations have a lot of local knowledge, they're very engaged. The academic institutions here in the town, Coast Guard facility are all strengths. Social services are very prominent here in Nantucket. This is on a previous slide, of course, Landmark House, Interfaith Council, local churches. The police department has a list of people that it needs to be concerned with during storms and the like. We talked about economic concerns as well. So tourism, is the town resilient? Is tourism resilient? It's pretty resilient, right? People keep coming back. You can't keep them away, but they have to have a place to stay. They have to be able to get to their favorite beach. Have a drink at a favorite bar, that sort of thing. If that restaurant is flooded frequently, is that possible? We need goods and materials from mainland to support tourism and other economic activities. And then, are people's perceptions of the destination changing over time? We talked about that a little bit in the workshop as well. So out of all that, we talked about the vulnerabilities and the strengths and how they kind of intermingle with those hazards that we looked at a few slides ago. And we came up with a lot of actions, probably hundreds of actions were mentioned among the 4 breakout groups. What we had to do was kind of coalesce all of those and put together the top priority actions. So there's about four or five, I believe, top priority actions. And they're in the report. We're going to focus on those over the next couple slides. So this one really surprised me, actually. Maybe you all saw it coming. I didn't see it coming, so shame on me. But resilience coordination here in the town. How do we really grow this into something that isn't just a one-time deal? We're just going to talk about resilience 1 year and never again, or 2 years and never again. How do we keep it as a long-term piece of the discussion? So if there's a resilience coordinator position that's funded regularly, that person could facilitate and coordinate resilience initiatives, could review bylaws and regulations to ensure that they're consistent with resiliency, could come up with new policies, foster ongoing discussions within the community. And not up here on this slide, and I think it's not on the next one, so maybe it's sort of unsaid, is this person also could apply for grants, right? It takes time to apply for grants, it takes time to administer grants, right? Chuck and Holly, does it take time to administer a grant? How many do you already have, right? So another 5 grants doesn't sound like so much fun sometimes, but if there's a resiliency coordinator, that person could be applying for the MVP action grants and Mass CZM coastal site management grants, could be applying to FEMA for hazard mitigation grants. So that was one of the top priority actions. Isolation from the mainland and how to address it is another category of the top priority action. So this is really getting at 2 things. I mean, obviously, geographically you are isolated, but how to not become isolated in a way that it impairs all of these resources, infrastructure, and such that we talked about in societal. So one of the things that came up would be sort of, I guess for lack of a better word, we're calling it an isolation master plan, that it would address resiliency in the context of not becoming isolated for long periods of time. So making sure that steamship authority can get to the island, that pipeline can resume quickly. And then it's not just the short term about after the storm, but over the long term, making sure that the terminals are resilient. Because it's not going to do any good to have a boat out in the water the next day when the winds died down, the terminal is washed out. So there's different pieces of the puzzle that kind of have to be put together to make this happen. And I think it's important to say that it sort of includes emergency protocols, alternate access, that sort of thing. It's not just getting to Nantucket, but it's also once those boats and the airplanes are here, that whatever goods and services and staff and people are on them can get around. So it's isolation in the water, but also isolation is occurring once you're on land. So if a boat arrives the truck, that's to get to Nantucket, it arrives from the steamship authority, that's great, it gets through downtown, but now a bridge is washed out on the way to the west side of the island. That's part of this as well. Makes sense? So it's isolation from mainland, but it's kind of a misnomer. It's about all of these things together. Tidal wetland restoration. This is one of the priority actions that came up out of the workshop, and honestly, not a lot to say about it because it's very straightforward. We have tidal wetlands. We want them to be resilient so that they can protect us from flooding and from erosion. We want them to be resilient so that we have shellfish, fisheries populations that are viable, strong, healthy, and we need to know where they are, the tidal wetlands, and how to protect them, and make space for them. So as sea level rises, they have a place to go. If we built right up to the edge of them, as sea level rises, they're just squeezed, they're squished, they have no place to go. So eventually setting aside some land for tidal wetlands might be something to look at. The state has explored living shorelines a little bit, which involves kind of building out tidal wetlands where they've been impaired It's very difficult to get those permits because it involves filling in the open water, but if you can make a case that you can do it in a soft way without a lot of armoring, there may be a way to, in the future, kind of put back tidal wetlands that are lost while making space for them landward as they retreat as well. Historic preservation, this is something that's a big topic everywhere, but especially in Nantucket. Develop guidelines to preserve historic streetscapes and resources and buildings along the streets while mitigating hazards. There's a lot of guidance out there. I can talk for a second from the National Park Service, from a lot of states, how to make historic resources more resilient. And they basically all say the same thing: try to elevate, try to flood-proof when you can, try to not lose the historicity. It's a word that I learned a couple years ago from a historic resources person. Try not to lose that while you're making these projects happen to be more flood resilient. There's almost so much guidance out there that it's starting to become noise. And I understand the town is about to embark on a workshop in June, which will help cut through some of that noise and show what can really be done with historic resources. That's great, because I think that's needed. And suffice to say, this is one of the high priority actions to keep moving for this. Number 5, infrastructure resiliency plan. So this is something that some of the groups are talking about: water, some of them wastewater, some of them roads, bridges, etc. We kind of put it all together and called it infrastructure. So make it redundant, make it reliable, make it resilient. All these R's, right? The roads, the water and wastewater infrastructure in the face of changing climate, severe storms. One thing that came up, I think the words pavement management plan might have come up in only one breakout session. It might have been mine, but it's a misnomer of sorts, because it's not just about pavement. It's about how to holistically address your roads. And what's really fascinating about calling it pavement management system, pavement management plan, is that this came up in a CRB that we did just a couple of weeks ago, the one in Chicopee actually, a place that's very different in a lot of ways, but they chose to call a lot of these bullets, sort of group them into this terminology the same way that Nantucket did. So I was impressed with you and them sort of independently coming up with that. You'll see this term in the literature, but thinking about it in the context of resilience, I think, isn't always done. And it happened twice in the course of a couple of weeks. So developing alternate routes in case roads or bridges are rendered impassable, identifying, prioritizing sites for road relocations over time, elevations, hardening. I'm sure some of you have been to Wellfleet, which is probably start to talk about Ocean View Drive, which is very, very close to the Atlantic Ocean. And then identifying, prioritizing sites for culvert or bridge upsizing or new locations if needed, because those are parts of our roadways. Also not on here, but what's in our roads sometimes is utilities. So if there's water utility infrastructure in the road, we need to address that at the same time as part of our pavement management plan. If they're not in the road, we still need to address them, which is why they have their own bullet. So water and wastewater, and we're talking about sanitary sewers here, utility system resiliency, not just where the water comes from, not just where the wastewater is collected, but also where the water goes and the pipes through which it moves, and sanitary sewage, how we collect it, treat it, and then where we discharge it. These are all components that need to be looked at over the long term to make them resilient. So those are the 5 main categories of priority actions. I think it's worth it just to sort of go through them one more time without me talking. So resiliency coordination, isolation from the mainland and within the island itself, tidal wetlands, historic preservation, and infrastructure. And if you really think about those 5 main groups of high priority actions, did we capture everything? We really did capture a lot with those 5. So I think the workshop was very successful. I think we had some good discussions that we hadn't had yet to date. And I don't think that a lot was left out. When you look at the report, you'll see some of the other priority actions that came up that didn't rank kind of as high. And there's merit to those as well. And I've got to believe the town will be looking at some of those and possibly implementing components of them. We can talk about them after the presentation if you want. But those are the top 5 groups of actions. So the next steps, this is the exciting part. To wrap up this planning process, we're going to incorporate feedback from people who are here now or who have read the report. Chuck really wants to have this report into the state next week, and there's a reason for that. So you have till Friday of this week, which is tomorrow. As I said it, I realized that's not a lot of time. All right, you have 24 hours to provide some edits in the report, but we'll take edits next week, I think. But we're planning to get this report to the state next week because if we can do that, the town can apply for action grants, and there is an action grant the town has in mind to apply for, which is to start to take out action number 4, which is historic resources, and try to address some of them in more detail. If we can get this report into the state next week, and if the town gets an application in for an action grant, then I think that's going to be very exciting. It's going to really show that there can be momentum that's sustained through the MVP program. The grants come around every year. I think I've already, I haven't talked about this in a second. The grants come around every year. If you have a grant right out of the gate for 2019, 2020, you're going to be even more excited to apply in future years for action grants. All right, so yearly progress report. This is what will be happening after the consultant's kind of out of it. Looking at the top priority actions, core team meetings will be occurring. Does anything need to be revised in this report over the, going forward? The core team membership, is it appropriate for addressing the MVP action grants every year and looking at the plan and making sure it's implemented? Do other people have to be brought in? What about other work related to the MVP process or to resiliency? Making sure that's incorporated going forward. Through this kind of annual progress reporting, tracking the grants that are applied, received, action grants. So the first one will hopefully be the historic resources. What other steps are being taken? What potential other steps can be taken? We need to look a little bit further than those top 5 priority actions, maybe dig into some of the other actions in the report. Are there any difficulties or challenges identified during implementation? What's the feedback on that? How do we go back and kind of make things better going forward? Are there any data needs or gaps that can be addressed over time? So that's kind of how you stay certified as an MVP community. Okay, and with that, we'll take questions or comments about the report. If you haven't read the report, we can just kind of discuss some of the things you've heard tonight.
How many people read the report? Okay, so that's helpful to at least, and we're happy to, discuss anything that, Dave has covered. Plus, if you want to open up the reports, talk about a particular section, we're happy to do that too.
So from a practical perspective, what is the best way to submit official comments? I mean, those of us that are here, but obviously there's a lot of people at the meeting in January and there's not very many people here. So now that we know there's a timeline of tomorrow, which was not clear to anyone.
No, I know that was a surprise, and we just so.
I just want to make sure that our colleagues that said they couldn't be here, that said, oh Sarah, will you bring back some of the information that we put that
That's a good point. We could probably loosen that up. The deadline is driven by, April 19th is the application deadline for the MVP action grant.
Mm-hmm.
And to qualify and to submit an action grant, we need this in the hands of the state and reviewed before that date. Because that would, technically make us MVP certified, because action grants are only available to certified communities. And I confirmed this with the state. They, are willing to work with us, given, kind of a short notice of the upcoming action grant, but, also seeing that we're making tremendous progress and that we had this, listening session already scheduled. So, I'm willing to, try to make that as kind of a community decision, even next Wednesday. I would, and again, we're all busy, we're all doing many other things, and I would like to get it to the state by the end of next week.
I think it's important to say, and I don't know if this helps, I hope it does, that the report is really a documentation of the workshop. So if you were present at the workshop, what you want to do is flip through, and maybe you were in the red group. You'd like to see what the blue group was talking about. So that's in here. So I think it's a quick read because, well, it really isn't that much text. But in addition to that, many of you were present, you'll immediately remember it'll just take you right back to that day and the discussion that we had and the voting that we did at the end with the 3 red dots. I mean, that's kind of what this is documenting. So you're not going to find any surprises in here. There's not a conclusion drawn that's different than what we discussed that day.
And maybe this is helpful. This is a living document, as you can see, or what David described, was that there's going to be an ongoing process that the town is going to be following to capture updates, and it's going to be a public process because this is a community's document. And so as we kind of use it, we'll update it. I'm happy to take comments, any other time after this does go to the state, because we want to start capturing that so when we actually come together as a large group, we can pull that all back. So, and just like, the hazard mitigation plan, we're doing the same process. And, so this is not the only, bite at the apple, but I think you bring up a good point, the timing is just tight. We'd like to, if we can, get this kind of put together so we can submit for an action.
Harvey, it sounds like this part of this application is getting in the queue and lining up with other communities that are trying to do the same thing.
So these are competitive grants.
And is there any downside to getting it in now and tweaking it later?
No, and we'd be happy if, people come to us, a month from now and say, hey, we really want to talk about, some part of this. We'll be happy to, kind of pull together a group to do that. And again, this is a living, but it's a community document. So it's going to evolve over time. And I know we're gathering a lot of interest in the whole, community resilience, coastal resilience, hazard mitigation planning. And, Holly and I are working very closely together to make sure the plans are the same.
And maybe it's worth it to actually just go through the table of contents for those who haven't read it. And I'm guessing most of you printed it or started to print it but didn't read it.
So there's a slide there that does have
So we'll do that, and then I'll also just kind of go through it.
Would that be helpful? Yeah. Yes. You think?
While you're setting that up,
Huh?
can I ask another question?
Absolutely.
So I'm curious about, so one thing that our group talked a lot about was that this is all opinion. So while we have, people in the room have lots of different areas of expertise and we're all members of the community, and so we all have different types of interests, which is wonderful, but this is very much an opinion-driven document. And so somebody would bring something up that we're like, yeah, we should know more about that, but no one in the room had, the data for X, Y, and Z. And so it was brought up a lot about, I know that one of the finding number, or the table at the end, I think it was, number 8 was community engagement around resilience with experts. And so I know that's ranked less, but we were basically trying to put forth that we can come up with what we think is interesting and what might help, but we aren't the coastal engineers, that maybe we can learn from other communities that have done this. So I guess what my question is, how much weight does our opinions about what would work actually weigh into what Nantucket does?
So I think I think you bring up a good point, but I think what we need to try to do is to build on that thought. And how does that translate into something of action? And you bring up needing more information. Well, if we can clarify, the scope around something like that, that would be something we could probably identify and then, maybe try to move it up the list.
Or I think having it as one of the bullets in the resiliency coordinator position. So that's kind of when that came up and everybody was like, oh, we could put kind of all these different ideas we have into what that person's position would be, is to do kind of, at the very least, a literature review of what has been done in other communities and kind of, not to, we're building this dream position for adding everything, but I think that's kind of where we were thinking of having a coordinator who coordinates what's already being done with all the different organizations on the island, but also then can bring in some of that expertise.
National and international.
Yeah.
Or education.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think Matt Fee was in my group, and I think he brought it up a lot. And he's like, I don't know, like we know this is a problem, but I don't know how to solve it.
I think that'd be good to add to that group of
Yeah, I think
I don't know, just like to bring it up, to bring that point of expertise up to a higher.
Yeah, and I don't wanna lose that because, when we look at
Yeah.
this, in a few months.
That's kind of what we're doing in June with our conference and that workshop.
Exactly. That would be the objective, or reaching that specific goal of getting more information.
We're getting to that.
Yeah.
That's a good idea.
Thank you.
So that's a good point. We can work that into that priority action in group one. So just going back to the table of contents. So again, it's a quick read. I lied. It's not 15 pages. It's 20. But there's a lot of graphics. So I think the first couple pages are very helpful in sort of setting the stage for what this grant is all about. Chuck, I'm sorry, I just knocked you in the back of my chair. We have a few pages that talk about recent hazard events, other hazard concerns. That's very helpful because it provides a good summary of what we saw in 2017, 2018, kind of sets the stage for some of the discussions that we had. Then the homeland section is going over the strengths and vulnerabilities, infrastructure, environmental, social, and cultural. How are they vulnerable? How are they strengths? We talked about that through some of the slides tonight, but the report does a really good job talking about sort of that dichotomy for some of them. They're vulnerabilities, but they're also strengths that we can leverage going forward to be more resilient. And then it kind of wraps up with recommendations to improve resilience, and then goes through some of that dot voting. There's an appendix actually that breaks out some of the details just to keep it readable. You can go look at the appendix F, I think it is, for some of the screening of action items. And then quick conclusion, it ends with those 5 high priority actions, acknowledgements. So it's kind of like I hate to downplay it, but it's kind of like glorified meeting minutes in a way. It documents everything that happened during the workshop. So again, not going to be a lot of surprises in there. If you were present for the dot voting and when Annabelle from the Nature Conservancy went through and told you which ones had the most votes, that's very much what the report is, what the report looks like. Oh, and then the appendix pages, you can look at the matrices that we filled out. There's sort of high quality images. You can look at the maps that were marked up. There's pictures, photographs of the dots on the voting. It's all back there. So it's fun to look at that stuff after the fact. Great.
It might be helpful to, if you know, or maybe Greg knows, the subject matter of the grants we're going to be seeking. I assume that must be well underway if they're going to be filed in 2 weeks. Are we seeking 6 different ones, or 1, or what? And that would help, at least give me a sense for how those grant subjects tie back to the workshop report and the priorities we've been talking about.
I'll go to that one more. You want to mention the grant?
Right, so the grants tend to get announced, and they usually have a time frame of 4 to 6 weeks from which you submit an application. And
So the grant has a subject matter, and
so it's usually like the
decide our
action
own
grant is tied to the MVP, and you have to do the planning process and work toward one of the the grant priorities to have a good chance of being able to receive it. It's a competitive grant.
So what are we doing? What are we asking to do?
So we just found out about this in March. And so we're seeking number 4 on the list, which is the historic preservation guidelines. And
That's number 7A on the report.
yes. And so, this is also something that falls on the coastal resilience plan in 2 areas. So it's a matter of kind of matching, what projects qualify based on how the grant, is written and what the requirements are for that. And there's a time frame that this work has to be something that's done, in the fiscal year. So we have 12 months or less.
Must have 1 year.
We have, 12 months or less. So it's got to be a project that can kind of, get out of the gate, get done, just in a matter of, several months. And so, there are gonna be other, grants announced, like from, CDM in terms of coastal resiliency, pollution, remediation, water quality. There's likely even to be federal grants that we could apply for that fall closer to the hazard mitigation plan. And so we have to dance and, kind of adapt. But what this is all driving to is having, really some well thought out projects that we can have toward the top of the list. What you might also be interested in knowing is, Holly and I have been working really closely on the hazard mitigation plan. And that we have 55, potential projects or areas that were identified in that. 11 of those are already underway, either with a grant or state or town funding. So that's 20% of what we've already, identified. And we're matching, what's on hazard mitigation, what's on MVP, and where can we really, build the strongest case and then identify the target source.
So just to follow up, you have 11 underway. Is there a nice place where we can see those 11 and go to a site and we know you're
Yeah.
doing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on?
Yep, no, we're in, actually, we, Holly and I met this morning and we're right on top of that. So we will publish it, it'll be out on the website.
The document that lists them all out is the hazard plan, which is actually on the website. We got our formal FEMA approval this week, actually. So that is a big check off the box. And the actions that have been listed, we as a town are actually kind of making it a little more, it's a living document, so that section is gonna be a little more user friendly. So you, the public, can look at it and say, oh, okay, they're working on this. So we've actually been going through and seeing, okay, well, what department, who is actually gonna be in charge of that? Because again, there's 55 of them, and 11 of them, I think it is, that are actually on their way. They indicate not only the department who's required, but also what the cost of that project, what exactly is that project? And one of the great things is 2 of them listed quoted this. So not only would, if we can get this MVP approval and get that grant, if we can get that grant from the MVP process, not only will it help this action that we've identified as a collective whole, but it will also check off those 2 that we've already identified in our hazard plan. So there is that overlap with those 2 documents, which is great.
But I like your point, yes, we are gonna be more visible, kind of tracking the status, the dates, and, be able to have that information.
I think that's huge. Just one more thing. I think that's good for you and the public because often there's unless you bring it out
Yeah.
in an easy way for us to understand, you might come to the conclusion we're not doing anything, and that's not the case. So you really need to up the visibility, I think.
And a lot of this has been work in progress. And, I do apologize, we haven't been able to kind of make the information more visible, easier to communicate. And we're gonna try to work on that. We'd like your input as we start, putting stuff out there.
Along those same lines of the grants, I know that some of the CDM grants, are either only available or are more highly competitive when you partner with local land trusts. And I know we're talking with colleagues at the Conservation Foundation where you've been interested in assisting the town with that. And so that's, a way to explore the work that a lot of the land trust and conservation organizations do and work together to take some off your plate of managing all the grants. And so I think that dialogue.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up. And as a matter of fact, this afternoon, we did have a meeting
Okay.
with the Conservation Foundation on a, scoping a potential project.
Yeah.
That could be eligible for a grant. So, we do need that input in that dialogue. And, it can help, hopefully it can work both ways, they can bring resources and help us identify or clarify, something that can be done as part of the bigger problem or problem statement. Yeah.
I I'm concerned about the quality of the public engagement. You're giving us an opportunity to comment, but we haven't been together, those of us who participated in the workshop till January. And I understand, Chuck, from your email that the coastal resiliency plan is going to be issued in May. So I don't know who's working on this. I guess it's being done internally. And that concerns me because I think we have a lot of very committed, skilled citizens. And I look at other major issues in the town like housing, and there are citizens who have a quality engagement with that issue working with town staff. And I don't see that happening with this issue, which I think is so important. Who's gonna set the priorities? Who decides what grants to apply to? Who decides what area of the island gets attention first? I mean, those are questions that the community needs to be involved in. And I don't know how structurally we make that happen, but I'm not feeling that great about the extent of community involvement up to this point. I know we're working on a timeline that's not our own, but I'm hopeful from this point forward that we can think of ways of involving citizens other than just by public comment.
Right. Yeah, I think you bring up a really great point, is that we need to
Chuck,
better define.
the board voted in to have the Citizen Coastal Resiliency Committee, which will be appointed with the application will go out in the next couple of weeks.
Great, that's so good to hear. And will that work group then work to coordinate this, so all of this will come together somehow?
It'll be all about it, exactly. I don't know the makeup of it, but it's a citizen committee, maybe a board member on it, I don't know how they made it up, and we announced it the other day, it was actually on the committee list yesterday. That's gonna be posted in the paper.
So I think you bring up a great point. It's just gonna need, and we need to better, kind of figure out how much community involvement and when. And it's gonna be ongoing. And I'm sorry that, we haven't been able to pull more people in. But, I think if that's an area that we need to work on, let's do it,
Well, we're here, for instance, the coastal resiliency, the Nantucket Coastal Conservancy had our planning session, and we decided that one of our priorities would be to try and work in collaboration with other community groups in the town to have a resiliency summit where we could bring in experts from all over the country or even internationally. I mean, Matthew has talked about Dutch engineers, but that we really do build up on our expertise, and we just have a sense of what strategies are possible, what's out there. So maybe then moving forward, we would plan with this work group, with this town work group.
And I think, we're at the very early stages, and what Sarah brought up, we just need to get information, what's going on, and, just help better, refine our thinking and in applying the science, help find the solutions that we're gonna need. So I think you're gonna see a lot more in the future. It might have been a bumpy start, but, I think we'll hit our stride. And,
Well, we're here.
Yeah, well, and it's a partnership, we wanna work together with the public, with the Coastal Conservancy. Yeah.
Chuck, I don't know if you answered Sarah's question earlier about the email address that we could send comments to that you were.
So, I believe my email's on the webpage.
I have your email. Is that what you want?
Yeah, so send it to my
Okay.
email, please.
Okay, absolutely.
Yeah, no. So,
Thank
thank you for clarifying. that.
No problem. Well, we kind of.
Yeah, and even if you send it to Holly or.
Okay, we'll get it.
We're gonna circle
Do
back.
you
But
want
thank-
do you want a certain subject line in it?
I'll just put MVP.
Yeah,
MVP.
make it.
I'm sure it's not the only emails you're getting a day. That's for sure.
But these, definitely go to the top of the list.
And I apologize. I have another meeting for the
Okay.
email streaming team, so I have to go. So
Hey, thank
thank you
you.
very much.
Thank you.
Chuck,
Yes, yeah.
I don't know if anyone from the Preservation Institute is here to talk a little bit about the symposium in June. Holly, you probably
We're involved in that.
right about keeping history above water. And we've just ordered copies of this book, The Water Will Come, by Jeff Goodell,
Yes.
and he will be the keynote speaker. We know very little about this, but we'd like to help
Well, see me
publicize
afterwards,
it
yeah.
or do whatever.
Yeah, you're gonna see more information shortly, and we've been doing some planning with them, the organizers, and we're supporting it, but we're not leading it. And so definitely this get together, that's open, for everybody as well to get involved. It's gonna be a pretty special conference. There's information out, there's information out on the web, the
There is,
History
yes.
of Water website
You
now.
go to their website right now.
And I guess probably the end of this week, we'll have a link from our website to that site with, some of the early information. But I'm glad you brought that up because, you want to at least have that on the calendar so you can be available to participate. Anybody else?
Okay, and then the less I carry back the better, if anybody wants a hard copy. Key report.
So well, thank you, everyone. It's great having this participation. I would like to see more people here. But, I think you're gonna be seeing more of these events, and this is just such an important topic, for the community here that, it does deserve a lot of our attention. And we do want your input and comments because this is a problem that, the more eyes that we have that can look and see and help us with it, the better it will be. So thank you for attending tonight, and please call me or send me any comments on the email. And that's almost any time. I've got an open door policy, so please feel free to.
And that goes also for the hazard plan too. If there are comments that you want to provide between now, and we're gonna be looking at, we're always looking at it, but, we have 5 years, another update. Again, it's a living document, if there's something that you want to have, so that way when we move forward, we can do that, not a problem. So we just want to have that. And the whole complete document is on the website. Great.
And any suggestions for improving the website,
Yes.
material to add, links to, we'll put that up.
We'll put that on the
PowerPoint.
website.
So please, reach out, we wanna make it better and, more usable for everybody. And if you have links, information, something you read or see, in the research you're doing or, something meaningful, we're happy to provide a link and kind of compile that, so. Very good. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.